Ezekiel Oboba from Milan, Italy, opens this edition of the program. Greetings, Global Baba. Please educate me on the biblical view of tattoo and a man wearing earrings as a Christian.
Well, again, it's not biblical, just like it's not biblical for you to go to toilet. You go to toilet without a Bible verse. You pee without a Bible verse. You wear your shoes without a Bible verse. You wear slippers without a Bible verse. You lie down in the bed and cover blanket without a Bible verse. You lie down and put on the fan and you don't cover yourself without a Bible verse. You wear rings without a Bible verse.
Global Baba.
Intercontinental.
Well,
I mean, these things are all culture. For example, I have 2 rings. People have been asking me, why do you have 2 rings? When you are married for 33 years and you only have 2 rings, you have tried. You should have like 30 rings. I've been married for 32 years and counting. The first ring is for the first time we got married. The second ring was when we were about 15 years in marriage. My wife gave them to me. And if she gives me more, I will keep wearing all of my fingers. They are my wedding rings, both of them. I could have added academic rings to my fingers, but I just decided not to bother. Somebody said, but some people can get initiated in occultism by ring. The gods are dead, not here.
Global Baba.
They're in the continental.
Let's push it. Charles is the next sender, and Charles writes. Charles Davy, by the way, doesn't tell us where he's writing from, but it says, Dear Global Baba, let me begin by thanking you for your good works of demystifying and bringing God closer to millions with your word-based teachings and interpretation. However, listening to part 13, I could not help but go back to Genesis 6, 13 to 22, where God instructs Noah to build the ark of gopher wood and all the other accompanying instructions. Unless you want us to disregard the Old Testament, Global Baba, and I know your teaching that day was from the book of Hebrews 11, where you were emphasizing on the concept of faith. I'll be grateful if you could further expatiate, because it seems as if I'm getting confused with what you are telling me. Thanks so much for your attention, and may God continue to replenish you as you continue to teach the gospel. Stay blessed, Charles.
Well, Charles, you can't disregard the Old Testament. Once you do that, then you're destroying the entire Bible. Again, like I've said, Hebrews 11:3. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things were made of things that do appear. Things were made of things that do not appear. Okay? So the Old Testament, you can't read it literal, because it's types and shadows. Types and shadows. Which means there's an explanation required. So that's why I always say the Old Testament must be explained. Must. For example, in the Old Testament, Moses said, God said, he will rain bread from heaven. God said, and God rained bread from heaven. In Exodus 16. In John chapter 6, Jesus said, no bread came from heaven. Is Jesus telling us to disregard the Old Testament? He couldn't, because he taught from the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, you see in black and white, God rained bread from heaven. But Jesus said, no bread came from heaven. Which means there's an explanation that is required. Just like God told Noah to build the ark. And I have shown you that God never asked Noah to build the ark. I'm not saying disregard the Old Testament. I'm simply saying there's an explanation of the Old Testament that has to be made to bring you to that point where you understand the communications that were taking place. Again, don't forget, their world is not our world. Their language is not our language. Their culture is not our culture. Their history is not our history. Moreover, Moses' mode of communication was chida, parables. Because the people he was talking to were people with a hardened heart. So he couldn't speak in literal terms. He had to employ types and shadows. Which means there's a communication that requires explanation. So when I started teaching, I said the Old Testament must be explained, and that the New Testament explains the Old Testament.